Americans worldwide and millions of more, that is not imagination, but that is a lived reality. So now let's pull this into the media. Think about the last villain you saw in a movie. Was it Scar from The Lion King? Was it Voldemort from Harry Potter? Or maybe it was the Joker from Batman? What do they all have in common? It's their difference. It's their scars, it's their burns, their asymmetrical features or facial changes. They are literally written into their identities as villains. And here's the part that most people miss. It's that they're not just scarred, but they're isolated. They have no friends, they have no real community, and they have no romance. The narrative itself says that difference means you walk alone. And that whole idea was the spark for my project. The aim was to test a specific piece of the narrative, which is isolation. And when characters with facial differences are isolated, how does that affect how they are portrayed in media and in the real world? Do they get trusted? Do they get to be main roles? Do they get to be protagonists? Are they boxed in as villains and outsiders before the story even begins? And my goal was really simple. It was to take what many of us have noticed and put some data behind it and start arguing for a change and get better representation so our society can be more inclusive and we can have a better world for future generations to come. Because if we can prove this pattern, then we can start rewriting it. So the background is that media doesn't just reflect culture, it creates it. And 3 key theories helped explain why these portrayals matter in my research. The first one was the stigma theory. It was created by Irving Goffman in 1963. And, I'm going to summarize it. It's once a society basically attaches a visible difference, a scar, a mark, or even a burn, it isn't just neutral anymore, but that mark itself becomes something discrediting. It colors how the person is seen, no matter their character, who they are, or where they come from. In the media, scars aren't just skin, but they're symbols, and they're often weaponized to mean corruption, danger, or some sort of tragedy, which you'll see in the upcoming slides. The second one is the cultivation theory. It was by George Gerbner in 1976. And Gerbner argued that repeated exposure to a certain message shapes our entire perception of how we view reality. If across decades, children and adults both grow up watching villains with facial differences, they don't just enjoy the story, they start to absorb that worldview. And over time, difference is equal to danger is what becomes everyone's daily truth. And the final one was the social learning theory. It was created by Albert Bandura in 1977. And this one states that audiences don't just watch, they imitate what they watch. Children especially, they model what they see. That's why they're children. And if every scarred or different face on screen is rejected, bullied, or villainized, then kids learn exactly that is how they should respond to it in real life as well. Adults are affected too. They may start avoiding, distrusting, or even stereotype without realizing it. And together, these theories end up telling us the same thing, that the scarred villain trope is basically a cultural script used by screenwriters everywhere. But, here's the real question that drove my study. It was, what if we changed the script? What if characters with differences were portrayed with friends, were portrayed with communities, with love stories, even as protagonists? That is the question that led me to test specifically isolation as a whole. And why it matters, the impact it has, is that over 15 million Americans live with facial differences. Millions of more worldwide live with the same. Negative portrayals reinforce stigma in workplaces and even bias in healthcare, schools even. And survivors report believing their scars make them a monster or a villain in particular. So the methods I used, To answer this, I built a curated data set of 127 characters, which spanned 100 years overall. It was from 1923 to 2024. And this data set included animated films, live action blockbusters, documentaries, and real life portrayals. Each character was coded on variables such as the narrative role. Were they the protagonist, the antagonist? Were they the sidekick, the advocate, etc.? How were they portrayed? Their portrayal tone. Were they portrayed positively, negatively, or in like a mixed light? Their level of trustworthiness. They were rated on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 was the lowest, and 5 being the highest. And their social capital. How were they portrayed in society? How many friends did they have? Was there any romance in their lives? And were they part of a community in particular? And our selections required both visible difference and narrative significance. You may be asking why these? Because these are the exact dimensions real people with differences are judged on, right? Trust determines their level of opportunity. Role determines their level of visibility. Romance determines their humanity, and community determines their belonging and how much society truly cares about them. And I didn't stop at just counting. I ran chi-square tests to see if these differences were statistically significant, and I used logistic regression to see how much social capital predicted portrayal tone. And the blend of numbers and narratives gave me like a way to move past anecdotes and into evidence. And sadly, the results were both expected and devastating to me. To summarize everything, my first hypothesis was, do characters with no friends get portrayed as untrustworthy? The answer was sadly yes. Characters with 0 friends averaged a trust score of just 1.6, and characters with 4 or more friends nearly had perfect trust. Let's make that real. Voldemort has no friends, only fearful followers. Scar has no allies, only hyenas that betray him in the end. Both are portrayed as untrustworthy and corrupt. Meanwhile, in those same franchises, Harry and Simba are surrounded by communities and they are trusted without any question. This isn't just about individual actions, but it's not that they earn trust, their story already decided for them. That alone means to be suspicious, and connected means that you're credible. And what message does that finally send is that being friendless means that you're automatically a suspect. In schools, that translates to the kid who eats lunch alone in the corners being distrusted and being called a loner. In workplaces, it means that someone quiet is seen as unapproachable. And this is how fiction slowly starts to become the social truth in our daily lives. My second hypothesis was, do low social capital characters end up as villains or sidekicks? My answer again was yes. In my data set, 59% of low capital characters were villains or sidekicks. Nearly half of the high capital characters were protagonists or advocates. And think about Disney. Scar, Ursula, Dr. Fallacier, all of them are socially isolated. Now compare them to, Elsa or Moana or Aladdin even. They're always surrounded by their group of allies. And what's happening here is that if a character is isolated, they don't just lose trust, they lose the centrality of the story. They don't get to lead their own story at all, which is completely unfair. And if audiences never see characters with facial differences as leaders on screen, how do we expect them to imagine them as leaders in real life? My third hypothesis was, do romance arcs increase trust? Here, the results actually surprised me. They were mixed. Characters with romance arcs scored a 2.58, and characters without scored a 2.62. Technically, there's no real difference between them. But here is the bigger problem that we noticed, is that romance arcs were almost inconsistent. They were non-existent at all. And think about the Phantom of the Opera. He doesn't get the girl. Hunchback of Notre Dame, Quasimodo doesn't end up with Esmeralda. These characters are written as more tragic outsiders, and they're denied intimacy altogether. So the real finding here isn't just about the trust scores, but it's about erasure. And the media repeatedly says that difference is, undesirable. And that's one of the cruelest exclusions you can give to someone, because love stories to us make people more human. My fourth hypothesis was, does a strong social capital predict positive portrayals? The answer was highly yes. Nearly 70% of high capital characters were portrayed in a positive light. Meanwhile, nearly 60% of low capital characters were negative. The formula is so clear. It's that connection equals dignity, and that isolation means stereotype. And, you can take Shrek for an example. At first, he's an isolated character. He's portrayed as a monster. But then, when he gains community, Donkey, Fiona, and a family, suddenly he's cast as a hero. And that is the power of social capital. And that's exactly what this data confirmed in the end. And then my last hypothesis was, is isolation itself a stereotype? Yes. Among characters with 0 friends, 75% were portrayed negatively. It's not random. It's a narrative shorthand used by screenwriters around the world. No friends is equal to evil. From Voldemort to Scar to countless faceless henchmen, isolation is used as this storytelling shortcut. It makes it easier for them. And audiences start to internalize that, consciously or not, and that equates to being alone as being dangerous or broken as a person. And for people with facial differences, the stereotype is both tiring and devastating. The big results that, the main ones that we found is 75% of isolated characters were portrayed negatively. Characters with no friends had the lowest trustworthiness, and characters with low social capitals were mostly sidekicks or villains. And those are the results that prove that. These are the numbers. And again, 15 million Americans live with facial differences, and their representation in media directly shapes stigma, empathy, and their sense of belonging in our society. So these are just the charts and graphs that I made just to summarize these hypotheses. Again, characters with 0 friends are rated the least trustworthy. I used the chi-square test for this, and it was a very strong result. The interpretation of this is that isolation consistently signals danger or suspicion. Hypothesis 2, low capital characters were highly cast as villains and sidekicks and rarely cast as protagonists. By contrast, high capital characters were most often protagonists or advocates, showing the high level of bias. For my third one, again, 2.62, 2.58, not that much of a difference, but characters with romance arcs had almost an identical trust score to those without. This reflects the lack of meaningful representation for people with facial differences. My fourth hypothesis, that chart, nearly 70% of high capital characters were shown in a positive light, and 60% of low capital ones were shown negatively. This demonstrates how important friendship and communities are, and they act as protective factors against stigma in society. And for my fifth hypothesis, that it was that among characters with 0 friends, 75% were portrayed negatively, and isolation is consistently used as this narrative stereotype. And difference with rejection is what comes first to our minds when we think about it like that. So what does this mean in practice? It's to end the equation of isolation with evil. Media must stop coding scars as danger. Every time a scar or difference is paired with untrustworthiness, it reinforces centuries of built stigma. We need to stop and we need to reframe connection as power. Friendships, communities, and allyship should surround characters with differences. Belonging should not be some sort of luxury. Showing friendships, mentorships, and chosen families can dismantle that narrative that difference is exclusion. We need to restore, romance and desirability. Denying intimacy is basically denying humanity. That's what we see on screen. And representation must show that beauty and worth are not bound to symmetry. Lastly, we need to shatter the villain archetype. Difference should not default to monstrosity. The media has the power to reimagine people with facial differences as leaders, as dreamers, and as heroes. And if people don't start speaking up right now, then they're just going to continue building on that stigma, and that's going to affect people in the real world. To conclude, isolation is not neutral, it is weaponized in the media, and it turns difference into danger. Community and connection are protective factors, but romance and desirability are actually kept withheld. Negative portrayals are more dominant. They reinforce stigma instead of breaking it. And these portrayals do not simply reflect stories, but they shape stigma, and they remind us why authentic and inclusive representation is urgent. You know, me personally, I'm a high schooler. I'm a sophomore in high school. There are people with facial differences at my school. There are people with, who are just different. And I see people talking about them, and they get bullied sometimes, and no one does a thing to help them out or step up. And, obviously they're getting impacted by that. But if we can change from the media, starting from the media, how these things are viewed, then hopefully in the future, then we can get a better society, and we can get people fairly treated with more inclusion and representation. Before YRI, this is just, it all started from like a school assignment for me. And honestly, like, I got to interview a few actors for the school assignment too. And, I'm just super glad that I was able to take that one small topic that came in my head and like make it like so much broader, more expanded, especially with Vamika. Like, she was so helpful overall. And, like before, like research just seemed like really hard for me, and it was just like a lot of like, it was just really overwhelming personally. But now like I can make another one. It's like really good. For me, it was the structure. I feel like if I wasn't in YRI and I did this as like a solo project, I would have been like completely lost on like what to start off with and how I would end. Like the deadlines and like how everything was supposed to be done personally helped me a lot more. The mentorship was really good too. It was good to have someone to like back you up and just ask questions overall. So yeah.